The courtroom was packed that morning. Reporters filled the benches, cameras were ready, and everyone seemed to sense something big was about to happen. The Supreme Court doesn't often make headlines with drama like this, but today would be different. Justice Clarence Thomas sat high on the bench, his face calm but serious. He wasn't known for speaking much during court sessions. In fact, many years had gone by where he didn't ask a single question. But on this day, something changed. Across the room stood Pam Bondi. She was dressed sharply like always and ready to argue her case. She had been Florida's top prosecutor not too long ago. Now she was representing a powerful company tied to some very influential people. Her voice started strong as she addressed the justices. But just a few minutes in, Justice Thomas cut her off. He didn't raise his voice, but what he said hit like thunder. "This," he said slowly, looking straight at her, "is among the worst arguments I've ever heard from a former prosecutor." The room fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. Bondi blinked, clearly surprised. She tried to respond, but her words came out shaky. She fumbled through her points, trying to regain control, but it was clear Thomas wasn't impressed. He shook his head slightly, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then something even more shocking happened. As soon as Bondi stepped away from the podium, two officers walked up behind her. Everyone thought they were just there for security, but instead of stepping aside, they grabbed her arms. "Pam Bondi," one of them said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "you are under arrest." Gasps filled the air. People turned to each other in disbelief. Cameras kept rolling. Phones buzzed. One moment, she was standing tall in front of the highest court in the country. The next, she was being led away, handcuffed, in full view of everyone. She didn't say anything. No protest, no anger, just silence. And that silence made it even more dramatic. Reporters scrambled to get details. Some whispered that this had been planned for weeks. Others thought it was a total surprise. Either way, it was huge. A former state attorney general dragged out of the Supreme Court while doing her job. It felt like something out of a movie. But this wasn't fiction. This was real life. And it all started with one man, who rarely spoke, finally saying what he thought. Clarence Thomas went back to his seat like nothing had happened. His face showed no emotion, but inside the courtroom everything had changed. Outside, the news spread fast. Headlines popped up online within minutes. TV stations dropped their regular programming. People who barely followed politics were suddenly watching clips of the arrest over and over. Social media exploded. Some called it justice. Others called it a setup. Either way, the name Pam Bondi was now everywhere. But why did it happen now? Why in front of the Supreme Court? And most importantly, why did Justice Thomas speak up at all? To understand that, you have to go back. Not just days or months, but years. Back when Pam Bondi was still in charge of prosecuting crimes in Florida. Back when decisions were made that some people wanted to forget, but others remembered. And maybe Clarence Thomas never forgot either. It wasn't the first time Pam Bondi had been under pressure. In fact, her years as Florida's top prosecutor had been filled with moments where she was watched closely by reporters, by victims' families, and sometimes even by other politicians who wanted to know what she would do next. She started in that job back in 2010. The state was still recovering from the housing crash, and crime rates were high. People wanted someone tough on crime, and that's exactly what they thought they got. She made speeches about justice, about standing up for victims, about cleaning up corruption, but not everyone believed her. Behind the scenes, questions began to grow. Some people noticed a pattern. Certain cases never seemed to go anywhere. Big names, big donations, and suddenly, investigations just stopped. There was one case in particular that kept coming up again and again. A powerful businessman had been accused of running a shady investment scheme. He had deep ties to political circles, including some very influential friends. And sure enough, when the case landed on Bondi's desk, nothing happened. No charges, no trial, just silence. When reporters asked why, they were told there wasn't enough evidence. But then something strange came out. Bondi had gone on a luxury trip to Europe around the same time. The trip was paid for by someone connected to that same businessman. It didn't prove anything outright, but it raised eyebrows. And it wasn't the only time something like this happened. Over the years, more and more people started to wonder, was she really doing her job? Or was she protecting the wrong people? Not everyone thought so. Her supporters said she was being unfairly targeted. They argued that prosecutors can't win every case, and that she had done good things too. She helped take down gangs, they said. She fought for victims of domestic abuse. She stood up for law enforcement. Still, the doubts stayed. Then, in 2016, she left office. She stepped away from the role of Attorney General and moved into new circles, closer to Washington, D.C., and closer to power. She became a familiar face on TV, offering legal commentary and defending political figures. She wrote opinion pieces, gave interviews, and built a reputation as a strong voice for conservative causes. And eventually, she found herself back in court. This time not as a prosecutor, but as a lawyer representing someone else's interests. That's how she ended up in front of the Supreme Court that morning. But she probably didn't expect what came next, because sitting on the bench was Justice Clarence Thomas. And he was watching her closely. Thomas had seen a lot during his time on the court. He rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. He had opinions, strong ones, and he wasn't afraid to hold them. Some say he had been waiting for a moment like this. Maybe he had read the reports. Maybe he had seen the stories. Maybe he had heard from people who felt forgotten, victims whose cases were dropped, families who never got answers. Or maybe he had simply had enough. Because when Bondi opened her mouth that day, Justice Thomas didn't just hear an argument. He heard something he recognized. He heard the kind of reasoning that lets the powerful walk away while others suffer. And for the first time in a long time, he decided to speak up. He interrupted her mid-sentence. Not with anger, but with quiet disappointment. This, he said, is among the worst prosecutorial logic I've ever heard. The room went cold, and then just minutes later she was gone, handcuffed and led out by officers. It all happened so fast no one had time to react. But once the shock wore off, people started asking the same question. What really happened in those years when she was in charge? Because now, it looked like someone finally decided to find out. The arrest happened so fast that most people didn't even realize what they were seeing at first. 1 second, Bondi was standing in front of the Supreme Court justices, trying to make her case. The next, she was being taken out, handcuffed, arms behind her back, led away by federal officers in front of cameras and reporters. No one had expected it. Inside the courtroom, some people sat frozen. Others turned to each other with wide eyes, whispering questions no one could answer yet. Outside, the news spread like fire. Within minutes, headlines started popping up online. TV stations cut to live coverage. Social media lit up with clips from inside the courtroom. People who had never heard of Pam Bondi before were now watching the same moment over and over. A former top prosecutor, arrested in the middle of a Supreme Court hearing. But why? And how? Most people didn't know it at the time. But this wasn't just some random event. This arrest had been building for a long time. Behind closed doors, investigators had been digging into Bondi's past decisions for months, maybe even years. They were looking at old cases, emails, phone records, anything that might show if something had been hidden or covered up. They weren't just interested in her actions as a prosecutor. They were also looking into what she did after she left office, especially the deals she made, the people she met with, and the money that changed hands. And now it looked like they had found enough to act. The charges were sealed at first, which meant only a few people knew exactly what she was being accused of. But soon, leaks started coming out. She was being held for obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and conspiracy to hide evidence tied to a major lobbying scandal involving foreign influence. That last part? That's what really got people talking. Because, if true, it meant this wasn't just about her old job in Florida. It meant this went all the way to Washington, to the heart of American politics. Reporters started calling their sources. Lawmakers started giving quick statements. Everyone wanted to be the first to explain what had just happened. Some said it was a setup. Others called it long overdue justice. But no matter where you stood, one thing was clear. This was not just another court case. This was a moment. And justice. Clarence Thomas had played a big part in making it happen, because remember, he didn't just sit there silently like usual. He spoke, he criticized, he questioned her logic, her record, and maybe even her character. And then, almost immediately after she stepped away from the podium, she was gone. It was too much of a coincidence for most people to ignore. Had he known what was going to happen? Did he say what he said on purpose? Or was it just timing, bad luck on her part? Inside the Supreme Court building, things got tense. Other justices were seen talking behind closed doors. Some looked concerned, others looked serious but calm. There were reports of emergency meetings happening behind the scenes. People were asking questions like, was this appropriate? And, did the justice go too far? Some legal experts argued that Thomas had broken protocol by openly criticizing a lawyer in front of everyone. Others said he had every right to question the quality of her argument. It was his job. But what troubled many people was the timing of the arrest. Just minutes after Thomas spoke, she was taken out. It looked planned, and when word got out that the decision to arrest her had been signed off weeks earlier, people began to wonder, was this a message, a warning, maybe even a turning point? Because for years people had been saying that powerful figures could get away with almost anything, as long as they knew the right people, had the right lawyers, and stayed quiet. But now, someone had been dragged out of the Supreme Court itself. Handcuffs while cameras rolled, and it wasn't just anyone. It was a former state attorney general. Someone who once held the power to decide who got punished and who got to walk away. Now, she was the one facing the consequences, and Justice Thomas had been the one to speak first. Whether it was planned or not, whether it was fair or not, the message was loud and clear. No one is above the law. Not anymore. The arrest sent shockwaves through Washington. It wasn't just the dramatic way it happened. Handcuffs in front of cameras right after a Supreme Court justice had publicly criticized her. It was what it represented. For years, people had watched. As powerful figures avoided consequences, they saw how some got second chances while others didn't, how some cases mysteriously disappeared, how justice sometimes felt like it played favorites. Now someone who once held real power was being held accountable, in front of everyone, and that changed everything. In the days following the arrest, protests started popping up outside federal courthouses. Some were small, just a few people holding signs. Others grew into full-blown events with crowds chanting for justice. Some called Bondi a criminal. Others said she was being unfairly targeted. Online, debates exploded. Was this really about justice, or was it revenge? Did Clarence Thomas cross a line by speaking out like that, or did he finally say what many others had been thinking for years? Reporters chased every angle they could find. They dug into her past, her connections, her decisions. And with each new piece of information, more questions came up. Old court records were pulled. Emails between Bondi and top donors were leaked. Secret recordings surfaced, some of them unclear, but enough to raise suspicion. One clip showed her talking to a lobbyist in a quiet room. Another showed her walking into a private meeting with a businessman whose name had come up in multiple investigations. People started connecting dots. They looked back at old cases where charges were dropped or never filed, cases where victims waited for justice and never got it. One family made headlines when they shared their story on national TV. Their son had been hurt in a violent crime. The case was strong. The evidence was clear. But then, nothing. No trial. No explanation, just silence. The mother spoke through tears. She had the power, she said. She knew what happened, but she chose not to do anything. That moment hit hard. Across the country, others came forward with similar stories. People who had trusted the system only to feel forgotten. Some had lost loved ones. Others had suffered abuse and waited years for someone to listen. Now for the first time they felt seen. And Justice Clarence Thomas, he stayed quiet, didn't give interviews, didn't comment, just kept doing his job. But behind the scenes, things were shifting. Inside the Supreme Court building, tensions ran high. Some justices were concerned about what had happened. They asked whether Thomas had gone too far by openly criticizing Bondi during the hearing. Was it fair to speak like that before an arrest? Did it damage the court's image? Others argued that he had done nothing wrong. He pointed out bad logic. One legal expert said, "That's his job, what happened after? That's on the system." Still, the timing was hard to ignore. Minutes after Thomas spoke, she was taken away. To some, it looked like a message. To others, it looked like justice finally catching up. Either way, the impact was huge. Lawmakers who once praised Bondi now avoided reporters' questions. Those who had worked with her distanced themselves. Old campaign ads were quietly removed from websites. It was like watching someone fall fast. And the deeper investigators dug, the more they found. More emails, more meetings, more names showing up in places they shouldn't have been. A pattern began to form. Bondi wasn't acting alone. She had help from people who knew how the system worked, who knew which doors to knock on, which favors to call in. And now those same people were starting to worry, because if she went down, maybe they would too. The pressure built quickly. Congressional leaders met behind closed doors. Lawyers were hired overnight. Statements were rewritten again and again, trying to avoid saying the wrong thing. Everyone wanted to stay out of the spotlight, but it was already too late. The public was watching, and they weren't going to look away, because this wasn't just about one person anymore. This was about trust, about whether the justice system really treated everyone the same, and whether the people in charge had been protecting each other all along. As the investigation continued, more arrests became possible. More names might come up. More secrets might be exposed. And for the first time in a long time, people believed something real might change, not because of politics, not because of money, but because someone finally decided to speak the truth, even if it took years to come out, even if it meant dragging someone out in handcuffs, right there, in front of the whole world. The trial was unlike anything most people had seen before. It wasn't just another courtroom drama with lawyers arguing back and forth. This time, the whole country was watching. Because this wasn't about a random crime or some unknown person. This was about someone who used to be in charge of justice itself. Now she was the one sitting in the defendant's chair. Day after day, evidence poured in. Emails, documents, secret recordings, and testimonies from people who had once worked behind the scenes. The picture that came together was not pretty. There were deals made in quiet rooms, favors exchanged behind closed doors, cases dropped without explanation, and all of it pointed to one thing. Power had been used the wrong way. Some of the most shocking moments came when victims took the stand. People who had waited years for answers finally got their chance to speak. One mother stood up and told the court how her son was killed in a robbery that should have gone to trial. But instead, the case vanished. "I kept waiting," she said. "I thought maybe there was a mistake, maybe they just needed more time. But then I found out they never even tried." Her voice didn't shake. She looked straight ahead as she spoke, and when she finished, silence filled the courtroom. Another witness was a former investigator. He had worked on cases that involved powerful people. He said he was told not to push too hard. They wanted things to go away, he said. Not because there wasn't proof, but because of who was involved. More and more stories like this came out, each one adding another layer to the truth. And through it all, Clarence Thomas stayed silent. He didn't give interviews, didn't make statements, didn't respond to questions from reporters. But inside the Supreme Court building, people noticed something different about him. He started speaking more during hearings, asking harder questions, challenging arguments he didn't agree with. It was like he had decided it was time to say what needed to be said, even if it made others uncomfortable. Some legal experts saw it as a shift. He's been quiet for years, one analyst said on TV. But now? Now he seems like he's making up for lost time. Others weren't so sure. They wondered if the whole event had changed something inside him, if seeing someone dragged out of court, just minutes after he criticized them, had made him rethink his role. Was he sending a message? Or was he just doing his job? Either way, the impact was huge. Across the country, people began talking differently about the justice system. Not just about Bondi, but about how decisions are made, who gets charged, who walks free, and why. Some started asking new questions. How many other cases were quietly dropped? How many prosecutors made choices based on politics instead of facts? And how many people had been left behind because of it? In Florida, old files were reopened, lawsuits were filed, families who had given up hope started calling lawyers again, and in Washington, lawmakers started getting nervous, because if someone like Bondi could fall, who else might be next? Behind closed doors, meetings were held. Phone calls were made. Some tried to control the damage. Others braced for what might come next. But the public wasn't done yet. Protests continued. Investigative reports kept coming out. Social media stayed full of debates and theories. People weren't just interested anymore. They were invested. They wanted to know the truth, and they weren't going to stop asking until they got it. As for Bondi, the trial ended with a guilty verdict. She faced prison time. She lost everything, her reputation, her career, the life she had built. And when she walked out of that courtroom for the last time, there were no cameras flashing her way, no headlines cheering her name, just silence, and the weight of what she had done. Justice Clarence Thomas watched it all unfold from afar. He never said much about it. But maybe that was the point. Maybe he knew something most people didn't. That sometimes justice doesn't come fast. Sometimes it takes years. But when it finally does come, it hits hard, and everyone feels it. Because no matter how high you rise, no matter how powerful you become, you can still fall. And sometimes, all it takes is one person deciding to speak the truth. Even if it takes decades to come out. Even if it means dragging someone out in handcuffs right there in front of the whole world. The fallout didn't stop with the trial. Even after the verdict was read and the cameras moved on, the ripples kept spreading, like a stone thrown into deep water. People started looking closer at other prosecutors, other judges, other cases that had gone quietly cold. They asked questions they hadn't asked before. Why did some cases never make it to court? Who decided which ones got dropped? And who really benefited when justice didn't happen? Across the country, lawyers began digging. Through old files, reporters followed leads they had ignored for years. Families who had given up hope started coming forward again, asking if now, finally, someone would listen. Because what happened to Bondi proved something important. No one is untouchable. Not anymore. Inside the halls of power, things were shifting too. Lawmakers who once avoided the spotlight now called for investigations. Some said it was about cleaning house. Others just wanted to be seen doing the right thing. But either way, pressure was building. Congress held hearings. Witnesses were called. More documents were released. More names came up. Some were well known. Others were behind-the-scenes players. People who had worked the system for years without ever facing consequences. Now their time was coming. And Justice Clarence Thomas. He stayed quiet, as always. Didn't give interviews. Didn't comment publicly. But people noticed something else. He was speaking more during court sessions, not louder but more often. He challenged arguments he didn't agree with. He asked hard questions. He didn't let weak logic slide. It was like he had decided silence wasn't helping anyone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, he had learned something from what happened that day in court. That moment when he spoke up. And minutes later, someone was dragged out in handcuffs. It changed how people saw him. Before, many thought of him as distant, quiet, hard to read. Now, people were paying attention. They realized his silence over the years might not have meant agreement. Maybe it had been waiting for the right moment to speak, and when he finally did, something big happened. Legal experts debated whether what he did was appropriate. Was it fair for a justice to criticize a lawyer so openly? But others argued, isn't that exactly what the Supreme Court is for? To question, to challenge, to hold people accountable, even those who used to hold power. And outside the courtroom, regular people were watching closely. They weren't legal scholars. They didn't know all the rules, but they knew what they saw. A powerful person standing tall one minute and being led away the next. And they liked it, because for years, they had watched as people in charge seemed to get away with almost anything. Now, someone had actually faced the consequences in front of everyone. And that changed everything. Because now, people believed something was possible. That maybe, just maybe, the system could work the way it was supposed to. Not just for the rich. Not just for the connected, but for everyone. And the movement didn't stop there. More whistleblowers came forward. More stories were told. More secrets came out. And slowly, the truth started to come together. Not just about one person, but about how the whole system had worked for years. How decisions were made behind closed doors. How favors were traded. How justice had sometimes been sold instead of served, and now people were demanding change. Real change. Not just new laws. Not just promises, but accountability from the top down. Because what happened in that courtroom wasn't just about one arrest. It was about a moment, a turning point, a message sent across the country. You can't hide forever. Someone will speak up, and when they do, the world will be watching. So even though the trial was over, the story wasn't finished. Because now people knew the truth. And knowing the truth, that's the first step to making sure it never happens again. Because justice doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to everyone. And sometimes, all it takes is one person deciding to say what needs to be said. Even if no one else is ready to hear it. Even if it means dragging someone out in handcuffs. Right there in front of the whole world.